Following the death of King Agis I, the city-state of Sparta was left in firm Dorian hands. The surrounding settlements, especially those to the north on the road to Arcadia, were now Spartan dependencies, inhabited by the so-called Perioikoi, roughly meaning the dwellers around. The Perioikoi, being of Achaean origin, although free, were still considered non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, below the Dorian Spartans themselves, who enjoyed full citizen privileges. Agis' son and successor, Echestratus, now represented the Agis Royal House, while his counterpart and Soos' son Eurypon became the head of what was at the time still called the House of Procles. Unlike Soos, however, Eurypon was much more than a co-king to Echestratus, and it would be during his reign that his royal house was put in a more equal standing with the Agiads, the elder of the two dynasties. It is understood that during these early times, the Spartan dual monarchy rested solely on the power of the two kings. Each ruler, surrounded by the immediate members of his dynasty, exercised absolute control over his chief settlement, which in the case of Agiad House was Pitani, while the descendants of Procles controlled Limnae. As the Agiad dynasty was considered the elder of the two, it certainly exercised more influence, especially early on, with the towns of Messoa and Cynosura likely under the Agiad sway. Thus it comes as no surprise that many of the early sources did not even mention Soos, but regarded Agis as the sole king of Sparta at the time of its emergence. Eurypon was not only a king, but also a skilled politician as well as a demagogue, and was thus set to change the existing imbalance of power between the two houses. This was to be accomplished by a set of reforms, totally unexpected for this early period. In the words of Plutarch, Eurypon appears to have been the first king to relax the exercise absolutism of his sway, seeking favor and popularity with the multitude. Although the famous Spartan institutions such as Gerousia and Apella would not be established until later, Eurypon seemed to have founded an early form of a limited assembly or a council, which was able to elect some of the Spartan elders in charge of particular matters, taking over certain responsibilities previously held by a king. As we don't have any further information on these reforms, it is difficult to tell if these early magistrates held legislative, judicial, or executive powers, and how exactly were they chosen. What we do know is that an early oligarchy was taking root in Sparta and would later evolve to in some ways equal and sometimes even exceed powers held by the kings themselves. It is unknown how Eurypon's counterpart Echestratus reacted to this, but it's possible that he had complied, as any attempt to reverse this process would have likely alienated the king not only from a fellow co-ruler, but also from now increasingly important Spartan elders and much of the population. Moreover, no source records any internal unrest dating to this period, suggesting that the transition went smoothly, with the two kings still sharing majority of the power between themselves. Either way, this move brought much renown and prestige to Eurypon, who was reported to have been held in such high regard by the Spartans that his royal house came to be named after himself. According to Pausanias, the Procles, son of Aristodemus, called his son Soos, whose son Eurypon they say reached such pitch of renown that his house, Pietro called the Proclidai, came to be named after him, the Eurypontidai. Besides being a great politician, Eurypon also proved himself a skillful military commander. As the hostilities with the Arcadians did not cease since the time of Agis and Soos, with both of those kings possibly falling victim in the conflict according to different accounts, Sparta found itself in a prolonged war with many of the neighboring towns to the north. Although the chronology of the Spartan conquest of the Arcadian border regions remains unclear, attempts were certainly made to seize a rugged but strategically important area of Eurypont. The region of Eurypont consisted of small but inhospitable territory that provided passages to both Arcadia to the north and Cynuria to the east. It was inhabited by the Skyritai, a people of Arcadian origin living in 3 towns, Skyros, Oion, and Carii, originally subject to the nearby city of Tegea. Nevertheless, the Spartan army moved north in attempt to seize this strategic region and finally end the war against the Arcadians. Although the Skyritai were ferocious warriors, they could not hold the numerically superior Spartan army, and in the absence of a major involvement from the neighboring Tegea, the whole area capitulated to the Spartans. As Eurypont was apparently taken, its towns were made subjects to Sparta, and inhabitants given similar status to the Perioikoi. However, unlike the other Spartan subjects, the Skyritai, given their military frontier nature, would be incorporated into the Spartan army as a special light infantry unit supporting the main Spartan force. Although there is no precise information on the battle and who exactly led the Spartan force, Eurypon was specifically named in dealing with further Arcadian issue, while Echestratus made moves into Cynuria to the east. As hostilities with the Arcadians were still ongoing, it appears that the city of Mantinea and not Tegea was still in war with the Spartans. Eurypon was determined to put an end to it on his own terms. According to Polyeanus, Eurypon, king of the Lacedaemonians, found that the war which he had undertaken against the Arcadians was lasting longer than he had expected. In order to sow dissension amongst the Arcadians, he sent a herald to inform them that the Lacedaemonians would end the war if they banished those who were guilty of killing Agis. Therefore, those who had been responsible for the death of Agis banded together to avoid being punished by the people as the price of peace. They won the support of the slaves through the promise of their freedom and put to death all of their opponents. After the people had been divided into 2 factions in this way, the party who were in favor of peace assembled in a particular quarter of the city of Mantinea and threw open the gates to the enemy, and so by their help the Lacedaemonians obtained what they had been unable to achieve by the force of arms. While it is not specified whether the Spartans entered Mantinea or Agis' killers were simply extradited, it remains highly unlikely that the Spartan army was able to penetrate this deep into Arcadia during the Dark Ages, so the whole story could have been a later Spartan propaganda or a vastly exaggerated event of Spartans making peace with the Arcadians after years of hostilities. In the meantime, Echestratus decided to conduct a military operation of his own. The region of Cynuria to the east, although independent, was considered by the city of Argos to be in their own sphere of influence. Echestratus, wanting to present himself as an ally of Argos, a fellow Dorian city, alleged that freebooters from Cynuria were raiding and looting the Argive territory to the north. With seemingly no consent of approval from the Argives, the Spartan king decided to conduct a raid of his own. As the Spartan army invaded, the Cynurians were very likely caught by surprise and unable to mount any meaningful defense. Echestratus' raid was said to have been brutal, with Spartans killing all Cynurian men of military age that they found in the area. The true reason of this action remains unknown, as it could have been a preemptive action in order to cripple a potential adversary near the recently captured area of Eurypont. Either way, these actions would have long-term consequences, as it marked the beginning of continuous animosity with the city of Argos. After all, Cynurians were said to be of Argive origin, and with the Argive aspirations of expansion, the root of rivalry between the two emerging Peloponnesian powers was already created. Eurypon was said to have ruled until either 890 or 860, while Echestratus ruled until 870 BCE. What these two kings left to their successors was a Sparta stronger than it was in the previous century, but also increasingly surrounded by adversaries, some of them looking to protect their independence, while others looking to expand in the direction of Lacedaemon and face Sparta head-on. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, Chris Ernst, Panayotis Yiannopoulos, Fred Leckie, Tim Lane, ABC Shake, Derek Wildstar, Vineyard Illuminations, and Estate Care for their continuous support. If you wish to join our Patreon community and partake in the decision-making of the future content, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we'll see you again soon.